Friedrich Nietzsche. The lineage of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was the child of Darwin and the brother of Bismarck. It does not matter that he ridiculed the English evolutionists and the German nationalists. He was accustomed to denounce those who had most influenced him. It was his unconscious way of covering up his debts. The ethical philosophy of Spencer was not the most natural corollary of the theory of evolution. If life is a struggle for existence in which the fittest survive, then strength is the ultimate virtue, and weakness the only fault. Good is that which survives, which wins. Bad is that which gives way and fails. Only the mid-Victorian cowardice of the English Darwinians and the bourgeois respectability of French positivists and German socialists could conceal the inevitableness of this conclusion. These men were brave enough to reject Christian theology, but they did not dare to be logical, to reject the moral ideas, the worship of meekness and gentleness and altruism, which had grown out of that theology. They ceased to be Anglicans or Catholics or Lutherans, but they did not dare cease to be Christians. So argued Friedrich Nietzsche. The secret stimulus of the French free-thinkers from Voltaire to Auguste Comte was not to remain behind the Christian ideal, but to outbid it if possible. Comte, with his live for others, out-Christianizes Christianity. In Germany it was Schopenhauer, and in England John Stuart Mill, who gave the greatest fame to the theory of sympathetic affections, of pity, and of usefulness to others as the principle of action. All the systems of socialism placed themselves unwittingly upon the common ground of these doctrines. Darwin unconsciously completed the work of the encyclopedists. They had removed the theological basis of modern morals, but they had left that morality itself untouched and inviolate, hanging miraculously in the air. A little breath of biology was all that was needed to clear away this remnant of imposture. Men who could think clearly soon perceived what the profoundest minds of every age had known, that in this battle we call life, what we need is not goodness but strength, not humility but pride, not altruism but resolute intelligence, that equality and democracy are against the grain of selection and survival, that not masses but geniuses are the goal of evolution, that not justice but power is the arbiter of all differences and all destinies. So it seemed to Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, if all this were true, nothing could be more magnificent or significant than Bismarck. Here was a man who knew the realities of life, who said bluntly that there is no altruism among nations, and that modern issues are to be decided not by votes and rhetoric, but by blood and iron. What a cleansing whirlwind he was for a Europe rotten with delusions and democracy and ideals. In a few brief months he had brought decadent Austria to accept his leadership. In a few brief months he had humbled a France drunk with the legend of Napoleon. And in those brief months had he not also forced all those little German states, all those petty potentates, principalities, and powers to fuse themselves into a mighty empire, the very symbol of the new morality of strength? The growing military and industrial vigor of this new Germany needed a voice. The arbitrament of war needed a philosophy to justify it. Christianity would not justify it, but Darwinism could. Given a little audacity, and the thing could be done. Nietzsche had the audacity and became the voice. Youth. Nevertheless, his father was a minister. A long line of clergymen lay behind each of his parents, and he himself remained a preacher to the end. He attacked Christianity because there was so much of its moral spirit in him. His philosophy was an attempt to balance and correct, by violent contradiction, an irresistible tendency to gentleness and kindness and peace. Was it not the final insult that the good people of Genoa should call him Il Santo, the saint? His mother was a pious and Puritan lady, of the same sort that had fostered Immanuel Kant. And with perhaps one disastrous exception, Nietzsche remained pious and Puritan, chaste as a statue to the last. Therefore his assault on Puritanism and piety. How he longed to be a sinner, this incorrigible saint. He was born at Röcken, Prussia, on October 15, 1844, which happened to be the birthday of the reigning Prussian king, Frederick William IV. His father, who had tutored several members of the royal family, rejoiced at this patriotic coincidence and named the boy after the king. There was at all events one advantage in the choice of this day for my birth. My birthday throughout the whole of my childhood was a day of public rejoicing. The early death of his father left him a victim to the holy women of the household, who petted him into an almost feminine delicacy and sensibility. He disliked the bad boys of the neighborhood, who robbed birds' nests, raided orchards, played soldier, and told lies. His schoolmates called him the little minister, and one of them described him as a Jesus in the temple. It was his delight to seclude himself and read the Bible, or to read it to others so feelingly as to bring tears to their eyes. But there was a hidden nervous stoicism and pride in him. When his schoolfellows doubted the story of Mucius Scaevola, he ignited a batch of matches in the palm of his hand and let them lie there till they were burnt out. It was a typical incident. All his life long he was to seek physical and intellectual means of hardening himself into an idealized masculinity. What I am not, that for me is God and virtue. At 18 he lost his faith in the God of his fathers, and spent the remainder of his life looking for a new deity. He thought he found one in the Superman. He said later that he had taken the change easily, but he had a habit of easily deceiving himself, and is an unreliable autobiographer. He became cynical, like one who had staked all on a single throw of the dice and had lost. Religion had been the very marrow of his life, and now life seemed empty and meaningless. He passed suddenly into a period of sensual riot with his college mates at Bonn and Leipzig, and even overcame the fastidiousness that had made so difficult for him the male arts of smoking and drinking. But soon wine, women, and tobacco disgusted him. He reacted into a great scorn of the whole Biergemütlichkeit of his country and his time. People who drank beer and smoked pipes were incapable of clear perception or subtle thought. It was about this time, in 1865, that he discovered Schopenhauer's World as Will and Idea, and found in it a mirror in which I espied the world, life, and my own nature depicted with frightful grandeur. He took the book to his lodgings and read every word of it hungrily. It seemed as if Schopenhauer were addressing me personally. I felt his enthusiasm and seemed to see him before me. Every line cried aloud for renunciation, denial, resignation. The dark color of Schopenhauer's philosophy impressed itself permanently upon his thought, and not only when he was a devoted follower of Schopenhauer as educator, the title of one of his essays, but even when he came to denounce pessimism as a form of decadence, he remained at bottom an unhappy man, whose nervous system seemed to have been carefully designed for suffering, and whose exaltation of tragedy as the joy of life was but another self-deception. Only Spinoza or Goethe could have saved him from Schopenhauer, but though he preached equanimitas and amor fati, he never practiced them. The serenity of the sage and the calm of the balanced mind were never his. At the age of 23 he was conscripted into military service. He would have been glad to get exemption as nearsighted and the only son of a widow, but the army claimed him nevertheless. Even philosophers were welcomed as cannon fodder in the great days of Sadova and Sedan. However, a fall from a horse so wrenched his breast muscles that the recruiting sergeant was forced to yield up his prey. Nietzsche never quite recovered from that hurt. His military experience was so brief that he left the army with almost as many delusions about soldiers as he had had on entering it. The hard Spartan life of commanding and obeying, of endurance and discipline, appealed to his imagination, now that he was free from the necessity of realizing this ideal himself. He came to worship the soldier because his health would not permit him to become one. From military life he passed on to its antipodes, the academic life of a philologist. Instead of becoming a warrior, he became a Ph.D. At 25, he was appointed to the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel, from whose safe distance he could admire the bloody ironies of Bismarck. He had queer regrets on taking up this unheroically sedentary work. On the one hand, he wished he had gone into a practical and active profession, such as medicine, and at the same time he found himself drawn towards music. He had become something of a pianist and had written sonatas. Without music, he said, life would be a mistake. Not far from Basel was Tribschen, where that giant of music, Richard Wagner, was living with another man's wife. Nietzsche was invited to come and spend his Christmas there in 1869. He was a warm enthusiast for the music of the future, and Wagner did not despise recruits who could lend to his cause something of the prestige that goes with scholarship and universities. Under the spell of the great composer, Nietzsche began to write his first book, which was to begin with the Greek drama and end with The Ring of the Nibelungs, preaching Wagner to the world as the modern Aeschylus. He went up into the Alps to write in peace, far from the madding crowd, and there in 1870 came to him the news that Germany and France had gone to war. He hesitated. The spirit of Greece and all the muses of poetry and drama and philosophy and music had laid their consecrating hands upon him. But he could not resist the call of his country. Here was poetry, too. "Here," he wrote, "you have the state, of shameful origin, for the greater part of men a well of suffering that is never dried, a flame that consumes them in its frequent crises. And yet when it calls, our souls become forgetful of themselves. At its bloody appeal the multitude is urged to courage and uplifted to heroism." At Frankfurt, on his way to the front, he saw a troop of cavalry passing with magnificent clatter and display through the town. There and then, he says, came the perception, the vision, out of which was to grow his entire philosophy. "I felt for the first time that the strongest and highest will to life does not find expression in a miserable struggle for existence, but in a will to war, a will to power, a will to overpower." Bad eyesight disqualified him from active soldiering, and he had to be content with nursing. And though he saw horrors enough, he never knew the actual brutality of those battlefields which his timid soul was later to idealize with all the imaginative intensity of inexperience. Even for nursing he was too sensitively delicate. The sight of blood made him ill. He fell sick and was sent home in ruins. Ever afterward he had the nerves of a Shelley and the stomach of a Carlyle, the soul of a girl under the armor of a warrior. Nietzsche and Wagner. Early in 1872 he published his first and his only complete book, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. Never had a philologist spoken so lyrically. He told of the two gods whom Greek art had worshipped. At first Dionysus, or Bacchus, the god of wine and revelry, of ascending life, of joy in action, of ecstatic emotion and inspiration, of instinct and adventure and dauntless suffering, the god of song and music and dance and drama. And then later Apollo, the god of peace and leisure and repose, of aesthetic emotion and intellectual contemplation, of logical order and philosophic calm, the god of painting and sculpture and epic poetry. The noblest Greek art was a union of the two ideals, the restless masculine power of Dionysus and the quiet feminine beauty of Apollo. In drama, Dionysus inspired the chorus and Apollo the dialogue. The chorus grew directly out of the procession of the satyr-dressed devotees of Dionysus. The dialogue was an afterthought, a reflective appendage to an emotional experience. The profoundest feature of Greek drama was the Dionysian conquest of pessimism through art. The Greeks were not the cheerful and optimistic people whom we meet with in modern rhapsodies about them. They knew the stings of life intimately and its tragic brevity. When Midas asked Silenus what fate is best for a man, Silenus answered, "Pitiful race of a day, children of accidents and sorrow, why do you force me to say what were better left unheard? The best of all is unobtainable, not to be born, to be nothing. The second best is to die early." Evidently these men had little to learn from Schopenhauer or from the Hindus, but the Greeks overcame the gloom of their disillusionment with the brilliance of their art. Out of their own suffering they made the spectacle of the drama, and found that it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon, as an object of artistic contemplation or reconstruction, that existence and the world appear justified. The sublime is the artistic subjugation of the awful. Pessimism is a sign of decay, optimism is a sign of superficiality. Tragic optimism is the mood of the strong man who seeks intensity and extent of experience, even at the cost of woe, and is delighted to find that strife is the law of life. Tragedy itself is the proof of the fact that the Greeks were not pessimists. The days when this mood begot the Aeschylean drama and the pre-Socratic philosophy were the tremendous days of Greece. Socrates, the type of the theoretical man, was a sign of the loosened fiber of the Greek character. The old Marathonian stalwart capacity of mind and soul was more and more sacrificed to a dubious enlightenment involving progressive degeneration of the physical and mental powers. Critical philosophy replaced the philosophical poetry of the pre-Socratics. Science replaced art, intellect replaced instinct, dialectic replaced the games. Under the influence of Socrates, Plato the athlete became an aesthete, Plato the dramatist became a logician, an enemy of passion, a deporter of poets, a pre-Christian Christian, an epistemologist. On the temple of Apollo at Delphi, those words of passionless wisdom were inscribed, Gnothi se auton and medenagon, which became in Socrates and Plato the delusion that intelligence is the only virtue, and in Aristotle the enervating doctrine of the golden mean. In its youth, a people produced mythology and poetry. In its decadence, philosophy and logic. In its youth, Greece produced Homer and Aeschylus. In its decay, it gave us Euripides, the logician turned dramatist, the rationalist destroying myth and symbol, the sentimentalist destroying the tragic optimism of the masculine age, the friend of Socrates who replaces the Dionysian chorus with an Apollonian galaxy of dialecticians and orators. No wonder the Delphic oracle of Apollo had named Socrates the wisest of the Greeks and Euripides the wisest after him, and no wonder that the unerring instinct of Aristophanes comprised Socrates and Euripides in the same feeling of hatred and saw in them the symptoms of a degenerate culture. It is true that they recanted that Euripides' last play, the Bacchae, is his surrender to Dionysus and the prelude to his suicide, and that Socrates in prison took to practicing the music of Dionysus to ease his conscience. Perhaps, thus he had to ask himself, what is not intelligible to me is not therefore unreasonable. Perhaps there is a realm of wisdom from which the logician is banished. Perhaps art is even a necessary correlative of and supplement to science. But it was too late. The work of the logician and the rationalist could not be undone. Greek drama and Greek character decayed. The surprising thing had happened. When the poet and the philosopher recanted, their tendency had already conquered. With them ended the age of heroes and the art of Dionysus. But perhaps the age of Dionysus may return. Did not Kant destroy once and for all the theoretical reason and the theoretical man? And did not Schopenhauer teach us again the profundity of instinct and the tragedy of thought? And is not Richard Wagner another Aeschylus, restoring myths and symbols and uniting music and drama again in Dionysian ecstasy? Out of the Dionysian root of the German spirit, a power has arisen which has nothing in common with the primitive conditions of Socratic culture, namely German music, in its vast solar orbit from Bach to Beethoven, from Beethoven to Wagner. The German spirit has too long reflected passively the Apollonian art of Italy and France. Let the German people realize that their own instincts are sounder than these decadent cultures. Let them make a reformation in music as in religion, pouring the wild vigor of Luther again into art and life. Who knows but that out of the war throes of the German nation another age of heroes dawns, and that out of the spirit of music tragedy may be reborn. In 1872, Nietzsche returned to Basel, still weak in body, but with a spirit burning with ambition, and loath to consume itself in the drudgery of lecturing. I have before me work enough for 50 years, and I must mark time under the yoke. Already he was a little disillusioned with the war. The German Empire is extirpating the German spirit, he wrote. The victory of 1871 had brought a certain coarse conceit into the soul of Germany, and nothing could be more hostile to spiritual growth. An impish quality in Nietzsche made him restless before every idol, and he determined to assail this dulling complacency by attacking its most respected exponent, David Strauss. I enter society with a duel. Stendhal gave that advice. In the second of his well-named Thoughts Out of Season, Schopenhauer as educator, he turned his fire upon the chauvinistic universities. Experience teaches us that nothing stands so much in the way of developing great philosophers as the custom of supporting bad ones in state universities. No state would ever dare to patronize such men as Plato and Schopenhauer. The state is always afraid of them. He renewed the attack in The Future of Our Educational Institutions, and in The Use and Abuse of History he ridiculed the submergence of the German intellect in the minutiae of antiquarian scholarship. Already in these essays, two of his distinctive ideas found expression: that morality, as well as theology, must be reconstructed in terms of the evolution theory, and that the function of life is to bring about not the betterment of the majority, who, taken as individuals, are the most worthless types, but the creation of genius, the development and elevation of superior personalities. The most enthusiastic of these essays was called Richard Wagner in Bayreuth. It hailed Wagner as a Siegfried who has never learned the meaning of fear, and as founder of the only real art, because the first to fuse all the arts into a great aesthetic synthesis. And it called upon Germany to realize the majestic significance of the coming Wagner festival. Bayreuth signifies for us the morning sacrament on the day of battle. This was the voice of youthful worship, the voice of an almost femininely refined spirit who saw in Wagner something of that masculine decisiveness and courage which went later into the conception of the Superman. But the worshipper was a philosopher too, and recognized in Wagner a certain dictatorial egotism offensive to an aristocratic soul. He could not bear Wagner's attack upon the French in 1871. Paris had not been kind to Tannhäuser, and he was astounded at Wagner's jealousy of Brahms. The central theme even of this laudatory essay boded no good for Wagner. The world has been orientalized long enough, and men now yearn to be Hellenized. But Nietzsche already knew that Wagner was half Semitic. And then in 1876 came Bayreuth itself, and Wagnerian opera night after night, without cuts, and Wagnerienne, and emperors and princes and princelets, and the idle rich crowding out the impecunious devotees. Suddenly it dawned upon Nietzsche how much of Geyer there was in Wagner. Nietzsche considered Wagner's father to be Ludwig Geyer, a Jewish actor. How much the Ring of the Nibelungs owed to the theatrical effects which abounded in it, and how far the melos that some missed in the music had passed into the drama. I had had visions of a drama overspread with the symphony, a form growing out of the lead. But the alien appeal of the opera drew Wagner irresistibly in the other direction. Nietzsche could not go in that direction. He detested the dramatic and the operatic. "I should be insane to stay here," he wrote. "I await with terror each of these long musical evenings. I can bear no more." And so he fled without a word to Wagner, and in the midst of Wagner's supreme triumph, while all the world worshipped, fled, tired with disgust of all that is feminism and undisciplined rhapsody and that romanticism, that idealistic lying, that softening of the human conscience which had conquered here one of the bravest souls. And then, in faraway Sorrento, whom should he encounter but Wagner himself, resting from his victory, and full of a new opera he was writing, Parsifal. It was to be an exaltation of Christianity, pity, and fleshless love, and a world redeemed by a pure fool, the fool in Christ. Nietzsche turned away without a word and never spoke to Wagner thereafter. It is impossible for me to recognize greatness which is not united with candor and sincerity towards oneself. The moment I make a discovery of this sort, a man's achievements count for absolutely nothing with me. He preferred Siegfried the Rebel to Parsifal the Saint, and could not forgive Wagner for coming to see in Christianity a moral value and beauty far outweighing its theological defects. In The Case of Wagner, he lays about him with neurotic fury. Wagner flatters every nihilistic Buddhist instinct and disguises it in music. He flatters every kind of Christianity and every religious form and expression of decadence. Richard Wagner, a decrepit and desperate romantic, collapsed suddenly before the Holy Cross. Was there no German then with eyes to see, with pity in his conscience to bewail this horrible spectacle? Am I then the only one he caused to suffer? And yet I was one of the most corrupt Wagnerians. Well, I am the child of this age, just like Wagner, i.e. a decadent, but I am conscious of it. I defended myself against it. Nietzsche was more Apollonian than he supposed, a lover of the subtle and delicate and refined, not of wild Dionysian vigor, nor the tenderness of wine and song and love. "Your brother, with his air of delicate distinction, is a most uncomfortable fellow," said Wagner to Frau Förster Nietzsche. "Sometimes he is quite embarrassed at my jokes, and then I crack them more madly than ever." There was so much of Plato in Nietzsche. He feared that art would unteach men to be hard. Being tender-minded, he supposed that all the world was like himself, dangerously near to practicing Christianity. There had not been wars enough to suit this gentle professor, and yet in his quiet hours he knew that Wagner was as right as Nietzsche, that Parsifal's gentleness was as necessary as Siegfried's strength, and that in some cosmic way these cruel oppositions merged into wholesome creative unities. He liked to think of this stellar friendship that still bound him silently to the man who had been the most valuable and fruitful experience of his life. And when, in a lucid moment of his final insanity, he saw a picture of the long-dead Wagner, he said softly, "Him I loved much." The Song of Zarathustra. And now, from art, which seemed to have failed him, he took refuge in science, whose cold Apollonian air cleansed his soul after the Dionysian heat and riot of Tribschen and Bayreuth, and in philosophy, which offers an asylum where no tyranny can penetrate. Like Spinoza, he tried to calm his passions by examining them. We need, he said, a chemistry of the emotions. And so, in his next book, Human All Too Human, 1878-80, he became psychologist, and analyzed with a surgeon's ruthlessness the tenderest feelings and the most cherished beliefs, dedicating it all bravely in the midst of reaction to the scandalous Voltaire. He sent the volumes to Wagner and received in return the book of Parzival. They never communicated again. And then, at the very prime of life, in 1879, he broke down physically and mentally and sank into the vicinity of death. He prepared for the end defiantly. "Promise me," he said to his sister, "that when I die only my friends shall stand about my coffin, with no inquisitive crowd. See that no priest or anyone else utter falsehoods at my graveside, when I can no longer protect myself, and let me descend into my tomb as an honest pagan." But he recovered, and this heroic funeral had to be postponed. Out of such illness came his love of health and the sun, of life and laughter and dance, and Carmen's music of the South. Out of it, too, came a stronger will, born of fighting death, a yea-saying that felt life's sweetness even in its bitterness and pain, and out of it perhaps a pitiful effort to rise to Spinoza's cheerful acceptance of natural limitations and human destiny. "My formula for greatness is amor fati, not only to bear up under every necessity, but to love it." Alas, it is more easily said than done. The titles of his next books, The Dawn of Day, 1881, and The Joyful Wisdom, 1882, reflect a grateful convalescence. Here is a kindlier tone and a gentler tongue than in the later books. Now he had a year of quiet days, living modestly on the pension his university had given him. The proud philosopher could even thaw into a pretty frailty and find himself suddenly in love. But Lou Salome did not return his love. His eyes were too sharp and deep for comfort. Paul Ray was less dangerous and played Dr. Pagello to Nietzsche's de Musset. Nietzsche fled in despair, composing aphorisms against women as he went. In truth, he was naive, enthusiastic, romantic, tender to simplicity. His war against tenderness was an attempt to exorcise a virtue which had led to a bitter deception and to a wound that never healed. He could not find solitude enough now. It is difficult to live with men because silence is difficult. He passed from Italy to the heights of the Alps at Sils Maria in the Upper Engadine, loving not man nor woman neither, and praying that man, capital M, might be surpassed. And there on the lonely heights came the inspiration of his greatest book. I sat there waiting for nothing, enjoying, beyond good and evil, now the light, now the shade. There was only the day, the lake, the noon, time without end. Then, my friend, suddenly one became two, and Zarathustra passed by me. Now his soul rose and overflowed all its margins. He had found a new teacher, Zoroaster, a new god, the Superman, and a new religion, eternal recurrence. He must sing now. Philosophy mounted into poetry under the ardor of his inspiration. I could sing a song, and will sing it, although I am alone in an empty house and must sing it into mine own ears. What loneliness is in that phrase! Thou great star, what would be thy happiness were it not for those for whom thou shinest? Lo, I am weary of my wisdom, like the bee that hath collected too much honey. I need hands reaching out for it. So he wrote Thus Spake Zarathustra, 1883, and finished it in that hallowed hour when Richard Wagner gave up the ghost in Venice. It was his magnificent answer to Parsifal, but the maker of Parsifal was dead. It was his masterpiece, and he knew it. This work stands alone, he wrote of it later. Do not let us mention the poets in the same breath. Nothing perhaps had ever been produced out of such a superabundance of strength. If all the spirit and goodness of every great soul were collected together, the whole could not create a single one of Zarathustra's discourses. A slight exaggeration, but assuredly it is one of the great books of the 19th century. Yet Nietzsche had a bitter time getting it into print. The first part was delayed because the publishers' presses were busy with an order for 500,000 hymn books, and then by a stream of anti-Semitic pamphlets, and the publisher refused to print the last part at all, as quite worthless from the point of view of shekels, so that the author had to pay for its publication himself. 40 copies of the book were sold, 7 were given away, 1 acknowledged it, no one praised it. Never was a man so much alone. Zarathustra, aged 30, comes down from his meditative mountain to preach to the crowd, like his Persian prototype Zoroaster. But the crowd turns from him to see a rope-walker perform. The rope-walker falls and dies. Zarathustra takes him upon his shoulders and carries him away. Because thou hast made danger thy calling, therefore shall I bury thee with my own hands. Live dangerously, he preaches. Erect your cities beside Vesuvius. Send out your ships to unexplored seas. Live in a state of war. And remember to disbelieve. Zarathustra, coming down from the mountain, meets an old hermit who talks to him about God. But when Zarathustra was alone, he spake thus with his heart. Can it actually be possible? This old saint in his forest hath not yet heard aught of God being dead. But of course God was dead, all the gods were dead. For the old gods came to an end long ago, and verily it was a good and joyful end of gods. They did not die lingering in the twilight, although that lie is told. A hit at Wagner's Götterdämmerung. On the contrary, they once upon a time laughed themselves unto death. That came to pass when, by a god himself, the most ungodly word was uttered, the word, There is but one God, thou shalt have no other gods before me. An old grim beard of a god, a jealous one, forgot himself thus. And then all gods laughed and shook on their chairs and cried, Is godliness not just that there are gods, but no God? Whoever hath ears, let him hear. Thus spake Zarathustra. What hilarious atheism! Is not just this godliness, that there are no gods? What could be created if there were gods? If there were gods, how could I bear to be no God? Consequently, there are no gods. Who is more ungodly than I, that I may enjoy his teachings? I conjure you, my brethren, remain faithful to earth, and do not believe those who speak unto you of super-terrestrial hopes. Poisoners they are, whether they know it or not. Many an erstwhile rebel returns to this sweet poison at last as a necessary anesthesia for life. The higher men gather in Zarathustra's cave to prepare themselves to preach his doctrine. He leaves them for a while and returns to find them offering incense to a donkey who has created the world in his own image, i.e., as stupid as possible. This is not edifying, but then, says our text, He who must be a creator in good and evil, verily he must first be a destroyer and break values into pieces. Thus the highest evil is part of the highest goodness, but that is creative goodness. Let us speak thereon, ye wisest men, however bad it be. To be silent is worse, all unuttered truths become poisonous, and whatever will break on our truths, let it break. Many a house hath yet to be built. Thus spake Zarathustra. Is this irreverent? But Zarathustra complains that nobody knoweth any longer how to revere, and he calls himself the most pious of all those who believe not in God. He longs for belief and pities all who, like myself, suffer from the great loathing, for whom the old God died, and no new God yet lieth in cradles and napkins. And then he pronounces the name of the new God. Dead are all gods, now we will that Superman live. I teach you Superman. Man is a something that shall be surpassed. What have ye done to surpass him? What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. What can be loved in man is that he is a transition and a destruction. I love those who do not know how to live except in perishing, for they are those going beyond. I love the great despisers, because they are the great adorers. They are arrows of longing for the other shore. I love those who do not seek beyond the stars for a reason to perish and be sacrificed, but who sacrifice themselves to earth in order that earth may someday become Superman's. It is time for man to mark his goal. It is time for man to plant the germ of his highest hope. Tell me, my brethren, if the goal be lacking to humanity, is not humanity itself lacking? Love unto the most remote man is higher than love unto your neighbor. Nietzsche appears to foresee that every reader will think himself the Superman, and tries to guard against this by confessing that the Superman is not yet born. We can only be his forerunners and his soil. Will nothing beyond your capacity. Be not virtuous beyond your ability, and demand nothing of yourselves contrary to probability. Not for us is the happiness which only the Superman will know. Our best goal is work. For a long time I ceased not to strive for my happiness. Now I strive for my work. Nietzsche is not content with having created God in his own image. He must make himself immortal. After the Superman comes eternal recurrence. All things will return in precise detail and an infinite number of times. Even Nietzsche will return, and this Germany of blood and iron and sackcloth and ashes, and all the travail of the human mind from ignorance to Zarathustra. It is a terrible doctrine, the last and most courageous form of yea-saying in the acceptance of life. And yet how could it not be? The possible combinations of reality are limited, and time is endless. Some day, inevitably, life and matter will fall into just such a form as they once had, and out of that fatal repetition all history must unwind its devious course again. To such a pass determinism brings us. No wonder Zarathustra feared to speak this, his last lesson. He feared and trembled and held back, until a voice spoke to him. What matter about thyself, Zarathustra? Say thy word and break in pieces. Hero morality. Zarathustra became for Nietzsche a gospel whereon his later books were merely commentaries. If Europe would not appreciate his poetry, perhaps it would understand his prose. After the song of the prophet, the logic of the philosopher. What though the philosopher himself should disbelieve in logic? It is a tool of clarity, if not the seal of proof. He was more than ever alone now, for Zarathustra had seemed a little queer even to Nietzsche's friends. Scholars like Overbeck and Burckhardt, who had been his colleagues at Basel and had admired the birth of tragedy, mourned the loss of a brilliant philologist and could not celebrate the birth of a poet. His sister, who had almost justified his view that for a philosopher a sister is an admirable substitute for a wife, left him suddenly to marry one of those anti-Semites whom Nietzsche despised, and went off to Paraguay to found a communistic colony. She asked her pale, frail brother to come along for the sake of his health, but Nietzsche valued the life of the mind more than the health of the body. He wished to stay where the battle was. Europe was necessary to him as a culture museum. He lived irregularly in place and time. He tried Switzerland and Venice and Genoa and Nice and Turin. He liked to write amid the doves that flock about the lions of St. Mark. This Piazza San Marco is my finest workroom. But he had to follow Hamlet's advice about staying out of the sun, which hurt his ailing eyes. He shut himself up in dingy, heatless attics and worked behind closed blinds. Because of his failing eyes, he wrote henceforth no books, but only aphorisms. He gathered some of these fragments together under the titles Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, and The Genealogy of Morals, 1887. He hoped in these volumes to destroy the old morality and prepare the way for the morality of the Superman. For a moment he became the philologist again, and sought to enforce his new ethic with etymologies that are not quite beyond reproach. He observes that the German language contains two words for bad, schlecht and böse. Schlecht was applied by the upper to the lower classes and meant ordinary, common. Later it came to mean vulgar, worthless, bad. Böse was applied by the lower to the upper classes and meant unfamiliar, irregular, incalculable, dangerous, harmful, cruel. Napoleon was böse. Many simple peoples feared the exceptional individual as a disintegrating force. There is a Chinese proverb that the great man is a public misfortune. Likewise, gut had two meanings, as opposite to schlecht and böse. As used by the aristocracy, it meant strong, brave, powerful, warlike, godlike. Gut from Gott. As used by the people, it meant familiar, peaceful, harmless, kind. Here, then, were two contradictory valuations of human behavior, two ethical standpoints and criteria. A Herren moral and a Herden moral, a morality of masters and a morality of the herd. The former was the accepted standard in classical antiquity, especially among the Romans. Even for the ordinary Roman, virtue was virtus, manhood, courage, enterprise, bravery. But from Asia, and especially from the Jews in the days of their political subjection, came the other standard. Subjection breeds humility, helplessness breeds altruism, which is an appeal for help. Under this herd morality, love of danger and power gave way to love of security and peace. Strength was replaced by cunning, open by secret revenge, sternness by pity, initiative by imitation, the pride of honor by the whip of conscience. Honor is pagan, Roman, feudal, aristocratic. Conscience is Jewish, Christian, bourgeois, democratic. It was the eloquence of the prophets, from Amos to Jesus, that made the view of a subject class an almost universal ethic. The world and the flesh became synonyms of evil, and poverty a proof of virtue. This valuation was brought to a peak by Jesus. With him every man was of equal worth and had equal rights. Out of his doctrine came democracy, utilitarianism, socialism. Progress was now defined in terms of these plebeian philosophies, in terms of progressive equalization and vulgarization, in terms of decadence and descending life. The final stage in this decay is the exaltation of pity and self-sacrifice, the sentimental comforting of criminals, the inability of a society to excrete. Sympathy is legitimate if it is active, but pity is a paralyzing mental luxury, a waste of feeling for the irremediably botched, the incompetent, the defective, the vicious, the culpably diseased, and the irrevocably criminal. There is a certain indelicacy and intrusiveness in pity. Visiting the sick is an orgasm of superiority in the contemplation of our neighbor's helplessness. Behind all this morality is a secret will to power. Love itself is only a desire for possession. Courtship is combat, and mating is mastery. Don José kills Carmen to prevent her from becoming the property of another. People imagine that they are unselfish in love because they seek the advantage of another being, often in opposition to their own. But for so doing they want to possess the other being. L'amour est de tous les sentiments le plus égoïste, et par conséquent, lorsqu'il est blessé, le moins généreux. Love is of all feelings the most egoistic, and in consequence it is, when crossed, the least generous. Even in the love of truth is the desire to possess it, perhaps to be its first possessor, to find it virginal. Humility is the protective coloration of the will to power. Against this passion for power, reason and morality are helpless. They are but weapons in its hands, dupes of its game. Philosophical systems are shining mirages. What we see is not the long-sought truth, but the reflection of our own desires. The philosophers all pose as though their real opinions had been discovered through the self-evolving of a cold, pure, divinely indifferent dialectic, whereas in fact a prejudicial proposition, idea, or suggestion, which is generally their heart's desire, abstracted and refined, is defended by them with arguments sought out after the event. It is these underground desires, these pulsations of the will to power, that determine our thoughts. The greater part of our intellectual activity goes on unconsciously and unfelt by us. Conscious thinking is the weakest. Because instinct is the direct operation of the will to power, undisturbed by consciousness, instinct is the most intelligent of all kinds of intelligence which have hitherto been discovered. Indeed, the role of consciousness has been senselessly overestimated. Consciousness may be regarded as secondary, almost as indifferent and superfluous, probably destined to disappear and to be superseded by perfect automatism. In strong men there is very little attempt to conceal desire under the cover of reason. Their simple argument is, "I will." In the uncorrupted vigor of the master soul, desire is its own justification, and conscience, pity, or remorse can find no entrance. But so far has the Judeo-Christian democratic point of view prevailed in modern times that even the strong are now ashamed of their strength and their health, and begin to seek reasons. The aristocratic virtues and valuations are dying out. Europe is threatened with a new Buddhism. Even Schopenhauer and Wagner become pitiful Buddhists. The whole of the morality of Europe is based upon the values which are useful to the herd.